And I remember going and doing a really big surgery. It was called a facial duplication surgery, where it was literally a child who was born with two faces, and we were removing one of those faces. And what stood out to me is in the days prior to that, we had done a lot of cleft lip and palate, which is fairly kind of over the plate surgical stuff. But I remember the feeling of like, but when we're gone, who is going to take care of these kids? And it really affected me as to the sustainability of some of the medical missions work. And I think it was a big turning point for me of actually wanting to look elsewhere. Because at that point, that's what I thought. I thought because I was a plastic surgeon, part of my role was to work from my vocation in terms of ministry. And I think that was a huge turning point for me of like, while plastic surgery is what I do, there's a lot of other facets to who I am, and ministry could look somewhat different. It wouldn't have to necessarily be paired to plastic surgery. And so I kind of moved away from that medical mission work because of that surgery.
This is the Made to Advance podcast. I'm your host, Brian Aulick. We're here to inspire and equip you for your best future. Well, we have got a great conversation coming to you today. Dr. Jeremy Williams is with us. He's a plastic surgeon and he works out of Lone Tree, Colorado. Jeremy is an avid outdoorsman. He has a massive passion for missions. He's been married for 26 years. He has 3 kids, and most importantly, his honorary distinction today is he is the first person to actually fly to our studios just so we can have this conversation in person. Jeremy, it's so good to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
Well, I know I read and I know that you're an avid outdoorsman, but I think that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And so I think for most of us, we think, oh, that's probably somebody who likes to, go out in a tent or something like that every once in a while. For my wife, it would mean you're in a cabin with electricity and air conditioning.
Sure.
But for you, when you say outdoorsman, you do some stuff.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Colorado. I have my family's been there for over 150 years, kind of on both sides. So grew up hunting, so spent a lot of time archery hunting, mostly big game like elk, and that kind of led to a love for the mountains. Okay. And in Colorado we have, depends on how you count them, but about 54 peaks that are over 14,000 feet. And I was away for a while during my training, so when I moved back, that kind of became an early passion of getting back into the mountains. So started climbing 14ers. That naturally led to wanting to climb bigger mountains. And so I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, it was probably about 12 or 13 years ago. And then that led to a desire to climb more high altitude mountains. So I spent some time trying to climb the 7 summits. So spent some time in Africa and then in South America. Enjoy the outdoors. Today, it's mostly just skiing, backcountry skiing, things like that. And I still do a little bit of archery hunting.
Yeah. Colorado, people, we of course love Colorado, but I feel like Colorado, anybody who goes there goes, I'm not coming back because there's so much to do. It's so beautiful. You've got you get to enjoy all the different seasons in Colorado. So I could see where if you grew up there, you're like, hey, this is going to be home. So when you trained for like a big climb, a buddy of mine, when we were actually preparing to go to Nepal, and I know you've been to Nepal too, and so we're going to be trekking through the Himalayas, and he started training with an oxygen mask, like on a treadmill, and he would, get this aggressive climb thing going and then get the oxygen. Do you do that stuff too? Or
no, so I've never done, things that are above 25,000 feet. The highest I've been is about 23,000 feet. So it's in that zone above there where you really need to learn how to climb without oxygen. But a lot of high altitude climbing is just physiology. Okay. And if your body happens to hold on to oxygen well, it's not a measure of your fitness. It's just a measure of your physiology. You're just going to do well at high altitude. And so some people are that way, some people aren't. I happen to be a person who holds on to oxygen well. And so climbing just became kind of a natural thing for me. So I never had to do any of the kind of oxygen restriction stuff that you're talking about. But I've also never climbed that high.
Yeah.
So.
Have you been with our mutual friend Jack? Have you been with him on one of these helicopter in, drop it? It's just 12,000 as far as elevation, but then he kind of trekked through the Himalayas. I'm guessing you've done that.
Yeah, countless times now.
Okay. So when Jack, our guys are just at times just huffing and puffing, and Jack is like a machine out there. Would you be able to no problem keep up with him generally, or are you still having to work at it a little bit?
I mean, I would say that, as I'm aging, I say this body's built more for comfort than speed now. So there was a day when it was, I could keep up with Jack. I remember one day actually trekking through one valley in Nepal with Jack, and he kind of caught up to me. He's like, you move pretty good for a big guy. And I didn't know if that was like a fat joke or just a commendation of how well I was doing. But I think it was his way of saying, you're keeping up all right. Yeah. So, but in general, no, I was usually behind Jack, but
that's high praise from Jack. If he told one guy on our team, and our team got hit with an amount, maybe you've seen this, but nearly everyone got wiped out by drinking yak milk on the trip.
Yeah.
And I remember one guy in particular, I won't even go into the details because it was gruesome, but Jack said to me one day, he said, yeah, that guy, he's a horse. And I thought that might be the most affectionate and positive thing I've heard Jack say about somebody. He's a horse. And
Sure.
I also made peace with the fact I'm never going to be described that way by Jack. And that's okay with me. So, well, let's go back a little bit. We're going to kind of walk through your story today, and it would be fun. Our mutual connection is you serve on a board with my wife, and she kept saying, Brian, you've got to talk to Jeremy. This is going to be such a fun conversation, and how God is at work in your life, and both in things you do with work directly, but then outside of work. But let's go way back and just tell me a little bit about kind of where you grew up, how you grew up, that sort of thing, and we'll just kind of walk through your journey.
Yeah, I grew up fortunate to be in a Christian home with Christian mother and father and even Christian grandparents, and grew up around, I was the oldest of probably about 20 grandkids, and as I was getting ready to go to college, there was a lot of options to go to college. Ended up going to a Christian college that my mom had gone to. Looked at lots of other places, really didn't put a lot of thought into it like kids do today, but ended up at a Christian college, met my wife there. We were both from Colorado. The college was in another part of the country. We kind of started dating during college, ended up doing a couple of ministry activities together during that time, and then got married after college.
Okay.
Then from there, went to medical school in Texas, and we were there so we got married right before medical school, spent 4 years in medical school. And
do you like, you're a Longhorn, right?
Well, I went to UT, yes. So I'm
how big of a deal is that to you? Or is it like, that's just where I did medical school?
Well, like right now it's a big deal because they're actually playing well. Yeah. But I have 3 kids that all went to school in Texas as well, and they did not go to Texas, and they all kind of are horns down kind of people. Which just brings out the worst in me. So right now I would say, because it wasn't like my alma mater undergrad, but I'm still a big fan of Texas.
Okay.
Yeah,
gotcha. Yeah. Did you know, how soon did you know in college that you wanted to go to med school? I mean, was this like since I was a little boy kind of a thing, or is this graduate?
People ask that. I think there's some doctors that are born that way, but for me, it was like a process of elimination. It was kind of the only thing I was good at. By the time we got done, I found that I was really good at science. Interestingly, when I was in college, I had this great tension between, I went to this Christian college where they called, people who were going to ministry are called preacher boys. And there was a lot of kind of esteem around that where I went. And I always wanted to be a preacher boy. I always just really felt like, man, I wish I could do that. But I just never, today I would use the vernacular, I didn't feel like released to do that. But science was like the only thing I was really good at. And so it just kind of kept pushing in a direction, and I ended up going to college, and it would be decades later that I would realize that God would give that back to me in a different way.
The ministry passion you're speaking of.
That's correct, yeah. So years later, today I think I probably have maybe more impact than I personally would have had I gone that direction. And so it wasn't right away, and it was kind of a stumbling process of, kind of just moving in a direction that now in hindsight you can look back and say like that was God.
Did you have, like, you're going through these science classes, so you're probably excelling at your high school level, and then you go to college and you're taking more science, and did somebody ever say to you, hey, you should think about medicine, or was it just that you knew, hey, this kind of success at the collegiate level points to going on in graduate education in this certain vein?
Yeah, it's a good question. My journey is a little different. I actually struggled my first 2 years of college. Didn't have. I had okay grades, but not the kind of grades that should be able to get me into medical school. In fact, I had a kind of adjacent mentor, meaning another college student who was a year or two ahead of me, who's actually now my hunting buddy. But he, I guess he'll hear this now. But there was one night I was struggling with some grades in my first 2 years, and he said, I just said, man, I think if God wants me to go to med school, I'm going to go to med school. And he's like, yeah, but you got to get the grades. And I remember it kind of crushed my spirit, where I felt like, because I didn't have the grades at the time, I was struggling a little bit. And from that point on in college, there was like a switch that flipped. And I went from being kind of a very average kind of 3.0 type student to being a 4.0 student. It was just like a switch flipped in that sophomore year. And it was after that I really realized, like, I could do this. And then it wasn't until I got to medical school that I realized, medical school where I went, it's not like ABCD, it's like honors, pass, fail. Okay. And so honors is kind of like 94 and above, and then pass goes all the way down to like 60. So most medical students just pass. There's no reason to but for whatever reason, the first 2 years, which are your kind of academic classroom years in med school, I honored almost all my classes. And that was really just because of the rigor of the last 2 years of college. So it was kind of really when I got to medical school, after being there, that I was like, I think maybe I'm good at this. Like maybe this is my thing. And then that led to getting interested in, surgery and different aspects of medicine.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just surgery; it's plastic surgery, which is a whole unique subspecialty. Of all of the different, and we have friends that are doctors, and one's in orthopedics and one's in pediatric doctor and all this. We do know some folks who are in plastic work too. Plastic, I don't know what's the right way to say that. Plastics work.
We usually say plastics. Plastics, just as yeah.
So, but it's a unique area. It's a super demanding area. Why plastics?
So when I was, I got exposed to it in med school with a guy who was at MD Anderson Cancer Center down in Houston. It's a big cancer hospital. He was a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, and they were doing reconstruction of cancer defects. So like if you had a cancer of your mouth and they took out your tongue, they were reconstructing your tongue. If you lost part of your jaw, they were reconstructing that. And I always assumed plastic surgery was just what we all think it is.
Right.
And cosmetic. I realized, correct, cosmetic. And so when I realized that there's this huge breadth to the field, and it's one of the few fields in surgery where we operate from head to toe. So like craniofacial surgery with children, when I was a chief resident at Johns Hopkins, I participated in separating craniopagus twins joined at their head with Ben Carson and a whole team of people for about 3 days. So it's this huge breadth of surgery. And that really appealed to me because honestly, when I went to med school, I thought I was going to be a rural family practitioner. That's what I thought I wanted to do. And the irony of it is today, what I loved about that idea of rural family medicine was the relationships. Today, because of what I do, I actually get to do more of that than a lot of family practitioners do because I can spend a lot of time with my patients. And I do a spectrum today of reconstructive and some aesthetic surgery. But I get this real depth of relationship because I can spend time with them. So,
whereas your maybe normal family practice doc in today's medical climate is really got to be
running and
moving and grooving. Yeah, totally. When you think about all the different procedures that you've done, and my understanding is, you've also used your medical abilities to go into places where folks are in great need and outside of our country and done different things. If you were just kind of going back memory-wise to some times where a procedure has been particularly impactful on you, or if you just think, wow, I can't believe I got to be part of that, what experiences come to mind?
I think the most profound turning point for me, I used to do cleft lip and palate work in Southeast Asia. My first business partner had set up kind of a relationship in Ho Chi Minh City. And I remember going and doing a really big surgery. It was called a facial duplication surgery, where I was literally a child who was born with two faces, and we were removing one of those faces. And what stood out to me is in the days prior to that, we had done a lot of cleft lip and palate, which is fairly kind of over-the-plate surgical stuff. But I remember the feeling of like, but when we're gone, who is going to take care of these kids? And it really affected me as to the sustainability of some of the medical missions work. And I think it was a big turning point for me of actually wanting to look elsewhere. Because at that point, that's what I thought. I thought because I was a plastic surgeon, part of my role was to work from my vocation in terms of ministry. And I think that was a huge turning point for me of like, while plastic surgery is what I do, there's a lot of other facets to who I am, and ministry could look somewhat different. It wouldn't have to necessarily be paired to plastic surgery. And so I kind of moved away from that medical mission work because of that surgery.
What do you most enjoy doing today? If you surgically speaking, yeah.
So, I mean, my favorite surgery to do today is a form of reconstruction for breast cancer, where we transplant tissue. We basically take tissue from the abdomen and microsurgically transplant it like a kidney transplant to make restore a reconstructed breast out of a woman's own tissues. And so it's a really technically elegant procedure, life-changing for patients because it allows you to basically kind of like Mr. Potato Head move parts around.
It's amazing. I think you probably know my wife, Christina, had cancer and had a bilateral mastectomy. And I remember talking with her surgeon at the time, who we really, you develop a relationship over time. It's a lot of conversations, a lot of different meetings and appointments. And I asked him at the time, how did you get into this field? And he said, I always loved helping people. And so that was a thing that he had as a passion, you might say. And then he said, I loved art. And he was trying to figure out, he didn't think he could be a professional artist. He didn't know if that was his calling. But he said plastics for him was a way of combining the two, where he could help people. And it is. We have another friend who used to be part of our church. He'll send me pictures occasionally of things he's working on. I can't, of course, confidentiality-wise, I never see faces or anything like that, but he'll show me an ear. And he'll show me the before and after, and it's unbelievable how you can help people in that regard. I mean, I think about with some of what he's shown me, the before and afters, and what would it be like to go through life with an ear that was like the before, or a nose. He's shown me some nose pictures before and after, and I mean, you just want to say it's a miracle when you see the work that's done. I just feel like that would be so rewarding to see a person go back into the real world and not have to carry with them this feeling of, I know that I have an ear or a nose or whatever. Yeah. Do you see many patients like that would have those kind, or not so much?
For the first few years in practice, I did a lot of facial trauma, just because where I trained, we did a lot of facial trauma. So I felt very comfortable with that when I came out. And you see a lot of really devastating, injuries that are, really satisfying to be able to reconstruct and to fix and to put things back together and to have patients feel restored. And you get letters from patients. I still get patients, years and years later that say, thank you so much.
Wow.
So it's a really special kind of mystery, surgery is, because you get to affect people in a really unique way.
Now, those, on the one hand, you've got folks who are really in great need for a certain kind of procedure. Then you've got the way other end of the spectrum where it's just cosmetic beautification.
Yep.
And how do you, and I don't want to have any at all spirit of criticism or anything like that towards anybody who would have a procedure, but I suspect that at times you see people that are interested in having a certain procedure, and maybe as a Christian, you can sense, I feel like you're trying to fill a hole here that, I guess any thoughts on that? You can't sit there probably and say much about it. I don't know if they open up their lives to you much. How do you process that? No,
it happens a lot. And I think the farther you go in your practice, you get known for things, and then people start seeking you out, and it's not long before you get known for. So for me, most of my practice are patients in that aesthetic realm that are just kind of saying, I didn't think I'd ever find myself in a plastic surgeon's office, but maybe I'm a mother who's had, 2 or 3 children, and it's like I'm totally comfortable with who I am, but there's some things that I'm not comfortable with, like, babies have pulled muscles apart and my back hurts and I have, extra skin and things like this that, you get to kind of walk through with them. I always kind of unload that because especially in the realm of Christianity, we kind of dichotomize that stuff as though or moralize it a little bit, where we think that something like somebody seeking out surgery to address something that, life or time or, or nature has changed, that seems so bad. But yet I always remind women, you're putting mascara on and you're shaping your brow, where women, kind of pluck the lateral edge of their brow and not the medial. And there's a reason for that, because that's feminizing. And you're not doing that to be provocative to me, I'm assuming, right? And everyone's like, well, no, you're just doing that because establishes your
Yeah.
femininity. And I was like, these things are really no different than that, I think. But I see patients all the time that I say no to, because you can tell that the motive of what they're doing is not in the right place. And it's a real opportunity to be able to sit with somebody and say, I think you need to go back and maybe unpack your why as to why you're seeking this out. I tell patients all the time, I don't need your money. Not in the sense, I have 3 kids in college, I need their money. Who am I kidding? But but it's not about that. For a lot of these patients, it's about doing the right thing. And it's a real opportunity. I think that, most of what I do in that realm, I always say, is just kind of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? I mean, I'm not changing anything ultimately, just kind of putting things back where they were.
Have you ever been surprised by one, I just think it's really cool that you would have the courage to ask that kind of question. It's an uncomfortable question to probe into the why a little bit. Have you ever been particularly positively surprised by, in that moment, you're a little bit stepping into more of the realm of counselor, therapist, pastor. Have you been surprised by their level of engagement on the why?
It happens every week. I would say every week there's a huge psychology component of what I do. And I think women carry a unique, burden, especially in our culture. And so we spend a lot of time trying to tease that out for them, to help them to understand, you're fine, the way God made you. These are just things that have changed. And if we can help put them back where they go, so to speak, in terms of sometimes muscles have been pulled apart, and I have women who have real significant, back and posture issues from having had a baby, and you put their muscles back together in something like a tummy tuck, and it really does change their everyday functional life. And for other people, it's just as simple as, like, I'd like to be able to wear clothing, and I can't wear clothing, and so, but it is a funny area within Christianity. It's like the third rail. Everyone who asks me that, often it's usually husbands who are like, it's usually the weird question of like, how does your wife feel about all of this? And, my wife couldn't care less.
Yeah.
So,
well, the thing that part of, with the nature of our podcast, I really want to always, for the listener, for them to be asking, what's it look like for me to move forward, for me to advance, and particularly to move as those who are listening who are Christians, to move forward in God's mission, and that always takes courage. And so I think you probing in the way that you are and asking those questions, that takes a level of courage to say, okay, I'm going to open up this conversation for some maybe subject matter that not every doctor would cover. And I think similarly, it might be that somebody is a student or somebody is in the marketplace, and that whole realm of getting into those personal subjects, maybe they're hesitant to it, and sometimes you just have to ask the question, or you have to probe a little bit, and a conversation or relationship can go places that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise expected. So I think it's really cool. I'm curious. So when this is going to be a question, we can strike it later if you want, but you're dealing with some clients who are coming from probably higher resource backgrounds. And as we'll get to your commitment to missions later, but when you're seeing a lot of resource availability and you see the needs in the world that you know of, I guess, are there times, how do you process that? Yeah. How do you, and I feel that as a pastor, like how do I pastor people well with this, tension of resources are good and God blesses us with abilities and talents and all that, but also how do I speak into people's lives in such a way that encourages them to enjoy what God has given them, but at the same time recognize that God's given it to them for a purpose. Yeah, help me navigate that tension.
So, I think it gets back to kind of fundamentally how you view your resources, your time, talent, and treasure, in terms of, are those things that you really possess and that you're trying to steward, or you think that those are things that God just has given to you and you actually don't possess them. I think of like Lydia, who is a seller of purple, obviously this rich, wealthy woman that we see in the scriptures. And we don't see a lot of, kind of condemnation of the fact that she may have come from a different socioeconomic class. But that there's this, she was working outside of that, right? The reason she's mentioned is not because of her selling of purple, right? In that context, it was the context of what she was doing within the kingdom. And I think that God needs all of us, and it took me a long time to get to a point where I was comfortable with this, where I wasn't trying to spiritualize over the top of it, to say like, that's what the medical mission stuff was doing for me. Like, oh, I'm a plastic surgeon, but but I do cleft lip and palate. So like that was like the Band-Aid I could put over it if somebody felt like my job or my vocation was somehow unworthy. I mean, I think of a lot of people who sell cars, or things like that, that are, most of the world doesn't have a car. So it fits into the same category. I think it's coming to grips with that, you've just been uniquely placed here. Like, I didn't do this myself. I mean, God put me here, just like you put Daniel, in the presence of 3 Persian kings, and so it's not something that I've done of my own. And so fully occupying this space is more important than trying to figure out the guilt around the blessing that God's given me. And so I think when I see patients using resources and things like that, one way that I kind of view that in my mind is, we give out of our practice. So aside from our personal tithing, we have a tithe principle out of our business that comes off the top, and it's just the first check we write, and it's based on revenue that comes in. And I don't say that to be magnanimous. It's just because there's times where it's tight, but there are people that probably would never give directly to the work that we do, but we're interestingly using their resource and repurposing it for, I think, an eternal, initiative. And to me, that's not just a, clever way to kind of reconfigure my life. It's actually part of my purpose. It brings coherence to what I'm doing. And I think because, to be honest, years ago, what I struggled with was if I wasn't, to use you as an example, if I wasn't in that 5% that's inside the church doing daily ministry, well, then I was somehow kind of just sitting on my hands and maybe not as good, And so it caused me to sit on my hands more, to sit in the pew with my gift and do nothing, and leave everything else to the professionals, including thinking like I have something to contribute in terms of advancing the kingdom and missions with my gift, the way my brain's configured, not just in how I work in the operating room, but in how I address complex challenges in how we advance the gospel. And so, I mean, for me, it's a more holistic view of it. I don't have a lot of guilt about that particular aspect of it anymore. I realize it's just, this is where God's put me. How do I fully occupy this space?
Yeah, I love that. And that's part of why I was so excited to have you on, is because I really believe people God places them in all kinds of different spots. And I'm actually preaching on this very Sunday, talking about Esther. Well, she was placed in the place she was for a purpose. And some of us can be tempted to judge our own place. We can be resentful of the place God's put us. We can be disappointed by it. And really, the best response is not to be any of those things. It really is to say, what does it simply mean to fully follow Jesus in this place? And I think your example is so good on that. And I hope that those who are listening, they might not be plastic surgeons, but they can ask similarly. I don't, not to feel bad or somehow that their vocation is less than, because we need a lot of people who are passionate for the kingdom, who are in every sector, and I love that you're living that out so beautifully. Now, I know, just because of having talked to our mutual friend Josh, that there was like a conversation. He referenced it. I don't know the details, so you're gonna have to help me out on this. He said there was a time that you and your wife were having a conversation, and all he said was, she said something to you that was somewhat of a light bulb moment. Am I getting that right, or not really?
Well, I'm not sure. There's probably been a lot of those over the last. So now we've been married
for all of us.
Yeah. So now we've been married 30 years now. So,
oh, it's 30.
Now it is, because you probably saw on my CV, and I probably haven't updated my CV in recent enough. But I mean, there's been several of those moments. I think the most profound I would probably go back to would be actually when I realized that I was not truly a Christian. I think Josh knows that story, where I'd grown up very kind of. If you knew me, you would think, wow, he's clearly, I mean, I was a leader. I was in leadership in a Christian college. Mm-hmm. I was, I was an athlete, and everything externally looked like it was put together. And we were actually engaged to be married. And my wife, through a variety of circumstances, just had scratched the surface deep enough and said, I think you're a fake right now.
Wow.
And kind of called it out. And I remember nobody had ever done that. Nobody had ever loved me that deeply to speak into me, to say, I'm seeing things here that aren't consistent. Everyone else had just kind of come along for the ride because, there's charisma and other things. And of course he must be. And it literally saved my life. It was a moment of just kind of great awakening for me.
How did she back that up? I mean, she says something that's, I don't think.
Yeah,
really well, how does she probably give some examples or some reasoning on why she came to that conclusion?
There were some details that, I mean, she had kind of put together, and I mean, it was one of those moments. It was kind of like a Jonathan moment, right, with David, where once it was, you knew exactly, but it undid me in a way that really started a journey that it was a ripple that's still going on today in my life, of this reality of I have this person that God's put alongside me who will speak that truth into me. I mean, that's a clever phrase we use a lot in Christendom, but to really find that person who you are really open to. I always tell my kids you need 3 relationships. I use a climbing analogy with them in climbing, you always want to have 3 points of contact. Otherwise, you fall off the mountain. So either 2 hands and a foot or 2 feet and a hand. And I always say you really need 3 relationships. You need one up. You need that mentoring relationship that's pulling you forward. You need that one down in discipleship where something's coming out of you so you don't become like the Dead Sea where you have inlet but no outlet. And then you need that one that's at your level where they know all your stuff. And I've replaced that person now. I mean, my wife's that now, but I have other people at that level. But she was that in that moment. And it really did pivot me because she was able to just cut right to, these are the things I'm seeing. And she was right. Like there was not, it was inconsistencies. It wasn't huge deals, but it was just these inconsistencies. And I knew in that moment that I had been kind of playing a game. And so there's been several other moments since then where, like when I left residency at Johns Hopkins, at the end of residency, I was headed towards an academic career to stay in academic medicine, because that's kind of what you do when you go to a larger academic program like that. And at the end, she just encouraged me to write down 3 things, because I was having a hard time making a decision about it. And those 3 things she asked me, you need to kind of stratify into, do you want to do research, teach, or operate? And as I organized those 3 thoughts, she was like, well, then why are we looking at academic jobs? Because the way I oriented those, I said, I want to operate, then I'd love to teach, and research was last. And so, that's repeated itself, I think, throughout our marriage. So I'm not sure. Josh knows about all of them.
I think it was probably the first one that you did reference. And how amazing that she would speak that in. And it sounds like, by the grace of God, because a lot of people might hear a message like that from a spouse or a friend or a parent and go, I mean, I think probably human nature in most cases is to push back against it. But it sounds like she put it with enough love and enough truth that it sounds like you received it pretty much straight away.
Yeah, I mean, we were engaged, and I thought we were probably done after that, because not from my side, but just because I thought, yeah, you're right. And I remember I was still she was, it was over the phone, actually. She graduated a year ahead of me, and so she was already out working. We were engaged, and I was in my dorm, and I remember going down in my dorm and just kind of sorting that out for several hours with God. And, but it took a person to kind of bring me to that moment to where then God could say, and this is why you felt so much tension for so long, because we haven't met each other, and it was kind of a nice to meet you, welcome. And so, but anyway, it changed my life. There's no question. It set me on a different trajectory, and it was at a really important time, obviously, before marriage, but even more important for me, I was just getting ready to go to med school, and I don't know if there would have been enough time once we got married and the dynamics and things, so it was a really pivotal point.
In just a moment, I'd love for you to expand a little bit on how you started sensing decisions changing, or what was then sort of the ripple effect of that conversation. But before we get there, I just want to note how big of a deal it is to have those voices in our lives. Sometimes we're on the receiving end of somebody speaking an important truth to us. And in that place, it's so cool to see your example of saying, I'm going to humble myself in this moment and ask, what does God have to say to me? And that is an important step, and a lot of probably what gets spoken to our lives gets missed when we don't have that spirit that says, the thing is, and a person isn't somebody that speaks in, they might not always be 100% perfectly right. They may be 50, maybe 70, might be 95, but I think the heart of humility we want to have is, God, what part of this do you need to speak to my heart right now? But then on the flip side, we're all called at times to be what your, at that time, fiance was, and to be the person who's willing to say those things. And I mean, to think now, and we'll get to hear a little bit of this in these next minutes, but to hear how your trajectory was affected because of that singular conversation. And I don't know about you, I've got memories in my mind of where it's like, man, if that conversation hadn't happened, if that relationship wouldn't have been there, literally my whole life story would be different. It seems like that was one of those for you. How would you say, after she's got the courage to just be that lovingly honest with you, how do you start seeing that then ripple out in life practically?
Yeah, it's easier in retrospect because you can kind of start to put things back together, which I think is a really important way to look at these things. I think when, faith brings this coherence to our life where we don't understand how it all fits together, but we know we have a purpose to it. So we have this confidence that the things that are happening, and you see those as you look back. So when I look back now, I see that moment led to, kind of a vulnerability that I had as we moved forward throughout medical school and even throughout surgical residency. So medical school was 4 years and surgical residency was 7 years, in terms of how we made decisions together, that it wasn't just me pursuing a career, because I'm very driven, achievement oriented, but she was kind of always that check rein of, helping me gently, rather than forcefully, because I probably wouldn't respond well to that, of kind of different directions. And I think God really used her to get me into my sweet spot of who I was. And at any point, if I had chosen differently, it would have changed the whole trajectory of my life. It doesn't mean that God couldn't redeem that. It just means it's a big detour. Mm-hmm. And if you think of the finitude of our lives, I think, they boiled it down to 4,000 weeks. I think there's even a book written out called 4,000 Weeks of how short our lives are. A detour is a big deal. So as I look back now, there's that conversation really rippled out in terms of how we made decisions together, that impacted us as a couple and put us where we are today, where God, I think, now has really helped us to recognize just how he equipped us and used us, and what he has for us here.
One of the things that is really evident about your life and story and example is you have a huge passion for missions. And before we even unpack it, when I say missions, I mean that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So when you think of your passion for missions, what are we talking about? Are we talking about things more humanitarian oriented, or are we talking about what we sometimes talk about unreached people groups, where there's little access or no access to any knowledge about Jesus? Are we talking about a combination of it? Where's your sweet spot when it comes to global missions?
Yeah, I as I already alluded to, I kind of became disillusioned with the humanitarian aspect of things that are kind of unsustainable. So I was in a place when you mentioned Josh Duncan, who is an executive director of a missions organization that works with unreached people groups. We intersected at a time when I was in the middle of climbing, and had a specific event that had happened to me in South America on a high peak that kind of pivoted my life back towards things need to change. And when I came back from that, kind of a longer story, but the short version is Josh and I connected through literally a cold call by me to him about could I come on one of his trips. They were working at that time in kind of in East Asia, and I went with my then 12-year-old son, and it changed our life forever. We were able to experience people who didn't have any access to the gospel, and I'm kind of an Enneagram 8. That sort of injustice just boiled inside of me. When I came home from that trip, I knew everything had to change. I always say it's almost like I came home with my life in pieces, and I spent a long time trying to go to spiritual leaders like my pastors and people like that who really couldn't help me put those pieces back together. It took God kind of coming alongside of me and building inside of me this desire that this injustice of that there's people who haven't had an opportunity to respond to the question of who Jesus is, for me just change the whole purpose of our life. So, our purpose around missions is to see the gospel go where it hasn't gone. Kind of like Romans 15 says of Paul, he's like, to lay foundations of the gospel where there are none. It's not to say that taking the gospel across the street to our neighbors here is not important, because it is. But for us, that's the unique burden God has set around our shoulders, is to see the gospel go where it hasn't. And so that really is kind of our life's purpose now, is how do we hook our wagon of our vocations and our life and our children and everything else to that.
I love that. I don't know if everybody thinks of gospel access as a justice issue, but I love framing it in that way. I love the way you've just put it, because it is. I think of when you're living in the U.S. and we are just surrounded by gospel resources. You just could hardly throw a stone. Even in the most secular of contexts, there's still incredible opportunities to hear the gospel. There are Christians around, etc. Some places, obviously, less than others and more than others. But when we think typically, I think when a lot of people think of justice issues, They think of very important issues as well, and there are lots of different justice issues we could talk about globally, but I don't think they usually think of somebody not hearing about a Jesus who died on a cross for their sins, that they could come to new life and spend eternity with him, and a Jesus who came to redeem the whole world. If they have no access to ever respond to that, that is a justice issue. And the reality is that's where 42% of the world is sitting today. Yeah. And so we have this incredible privilege to do something about it. Now, you've said as a family, this is kind of the drum you're beating right now. I mean, this is what God has put in your heart. What's that look like practically? How's it play out?
Yeah, so as over the last few years in my business, I have a great business partner who's also united in this. We ironically both trained together at the same program. It's weird how God brings people from such different backgrounds together. But we do it different ways. Like, how it looks for me is spending about 30% of my time now engaged in these kind of activities. So it didn't start that way. It started with me kind of tithing 10% of my time. I felt like God had laid that on my heart to say, why don't you set aside 10% of your time? Because it was maybe easier for me to write a check than it was to give my time. And so 10% then during the pandemic grew into, well, what would it look like if I spent 30% of my time doing this? And what I found is that my productivity at work hasn't declined. It's kind of the whole principle of the tithe. God will do more with your 90% than your 100% could ever do. So as I give of my time, which is for me one of my most valuable resources beyond even my treasure or my talent, I've found that it not only has allowed us to engage in a global mission, but it's brought great satisfaction to our lives, because you start to, I love that equation for satisfaction, which is what you have divided by what you want. And there's nothing that will help you manage the denominator of the satisfaction equation of your wants greater than having a purpose.
That's so good.
And so now that's what it looks like about 30% of our time. And it's diverse. I mean, everything from something like this, coming here and sitting with you, folds into that. But it has to be intentional. So I carve that time out, and it looks different each year. We kind of have to map it out differently.
When you first, I'm going to rewind the clock a little bit here. So you first move was the tithing from the business. So you're just talking about monetary stuff at that point. When you guys made that decision, and that's you and your partner, whole practice wide, and so you guys processed this, and you go, let's do it. Did you have to restructure anything? Did you have to think? I mean, was it like, oh, we're fine, let's make it happen? It just means we have less going home at the end of the day, or was like, no, we've got to really look at the books here and ask how practically speaking, how does this work out? And you've alluded, there have been times it's not all roses. I think
it's never been roses since we did that. In fact, to give credit where credit is due, is actually my partner who said it. He said, "What would it look like if we started tithing out of our practice?" And I was like, that's a terrible idea, because I've got kids going to college. What are you doing? I need distributions from the company right now to just feed these 3 trolls that are going off to college. And so I thought it was a terrible idea. It also happened to come uniquely at a time where we were really lean as a business, and we weren't sure we were going to make payroll the next week. It was a really hard time. It was a terrible time to do it. But between he and I and my practice administrator, who all have kind of a unique kind of link to this, meaning that we're united in it, we just decided to do it, and we did it. And for the next 6 months, not only did we make payroll, but things grew. And so we've had to look at it, different ways at different times, but it's never been easy since then. A lot of times the hardest thing that we give, because now it's, with the time piece of it, that actually is the most costly thing to the business, is my absence from productivity. But my partner, steps up and so for him, going is more difficult for him, physically going out. So his going looks very much like he's crafted as this great producer. I mean, that's a gift of God and a money manager. So he's great at running the business, while I can use what I think I would just explode if I couldn't do it, the ability to go, which sometimes is really an important part of what I'm doing now in ministry, is actually having presence in some of these areas. But some of these areas require an investment of time to get to, because they're halfway around the world in remote areas.
Well, what a great picture. I mean, and of course, Christina jokes that, she'll use this phrase about our executive pastor, oh, that's Brian's work wife, this kind of thing, but there is a certain sense of complementary kind of dynamics to relationships at work. where you've got, with, of course, your own spouse, you've got complementary dynamics. But then what a cool thing for him to be part of this missions call of God. And it is, his expression of that is different than yours, but they are complementary because, in a sense, he's keeping the fort down a little bit on the practice side of things in a way that is freeing you up. That's what I'm hearing you say. It's freeing you up to go as much as you're going, basically. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely is. And it's that picture of the body of Christ that we're all necessary. And we're very different. We both have the same last name. We're both Williams. Huh. They call us the non-Williams brothers in Denver because we're not related. If you saw us, we look nothing alike. But I mean, really, Chris is his name. His strengths really are my weaknesses. And so, it's kind of this relationship is, part of the sword and shield of missions work. It's this, what he has to give me so that I can be who I need to be in relationship. And you realize, that's where unity is created. We have very different backgrounds. He comes from much more of an Ivy background. I come from much more of a, kind of mutt type academic background. We both ended up at the same places, and then God knit us together in just this really unusual way.
Wow.
So it makes work really meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Did you, who suggested the tithing time idea? How'd that come up?
I don't think it was that was just more of I knew I needed to do it. I had already been doing that a little bit, but as I shared it with my partner, just say in order for me to do this, I would like to be able to, kind of make sure that we're on the same page, because it's going to have an impact on the practice. If I'm gone at first it was, 6 weeks out of the year, and then that evolved into more. So, I think it came from me, but it really required a collective. But there was never a time where there was ever a reluctance on him. In fact, if anything, I think he would be the person to say we could be doing more.
Wow.
I think, and he doesn't come from the same necessarily spiritual background that I have. That's just something that, God's put in his heart. But it is a huge blessing when you have that, and you can, and not everybody has that opportunity to have that kind of a relationship inside their business. But the point is, I always, Genesis 3 talks about this, garden that, that Adam and Eve went out into, and God uses this term to go out and, basically subdue it. And when you look at that, it really is this pushing all the way to the boundaries of whatever your garden looks like, wherever the fence line is in your life, and everyone's is going to be different. But it's for us saying, hey, we're two plastic surgeons. How do we leverage that? Well, we could just say, well, we're going to write checks and give money, and every now and then we'll go do some cleft lip and palate. And that wouldn't be wrong, but for us, we know there's more that God's asking us to do. We don't need to be, anything that we're not. We just need to fully fulfill our potential.
Did you, as you were ratcheting up over the years, the amount of time you were putting towards these sorts of endeavors, was that always just a conversation with him, I don't know, at the beginning of the year, where you're sitting down saying, hey, I sense we could go a next level here, and what do we need to do structurally to make this possible? Or how does it practically work out then for the two of you?
Yeah, we do look at it annually. We probably look at it more frequently than that throughout the year, just as different initiatives come up, because sometimes things hit our radar where we'll just meet and say, I think this is something that we really could do. I think there's we had an opportunity to be a part of building a women's center in a really strategic part of the Middle East, and through an organization that was unique there. And so that was like a mid-year thing, and we just were like, hey, it's going to be a fair amount of money we need to throw at this, and everyone just says, let's do it. But I think at the beginning of the year, we try to sit down and say, hey, where are we at? Where are we going? And that kind of gives us a vision for where we're at. And sometimes you realize you've gotten off a little bit. Sometimes you've gotten so in the details of running your business, you've forgotten kind of your why and your purpose. And usually that's a really good time for us to kind of all elevate a little bit and kind of see the landscape different, because you can get sucked into the details of your business to where you lose this. I think that really is where the devil's in the details, where he will pull you into the running of your practice or your business or just your day-to-day life, and you will forget your higher eternal purpose and calling, and you'll miss out, because that is where satisfaction comes from.
When that's such a great word, and I literally feel like for the message I'm delivering this Sunday, I should just have you come and instead tell your story and take care of it. So when you're having that conversation, how practically is the why and what are we about question coming up? Is it that the practical thing of how much time am I going to be gone is causing the why to bubble up, or is it no? Let's step back here and remember the big picture first, and then start to get, I mean, how does it go down that, because what you just named, that tendency, and it happens with people in ministry too, obviously. It happens in there is an organizational part of this, and so you're all in it, and you can lose sight of the big why, the big picture. So I just think that's such a great word. When you guys are getting back to the big picture, what exactly happens? How does that conversation go? Is it being prompted by that specific question, or what?
So we focus it, because otherwise the why you can get this kind of quote mission drift in the midst of it, where there's certain things that would be really good things. Pick something like Mercy Ships, for instance, a great ministry out of Youth with a Mission, where both of us could kind of lean into something like that, and it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be a really good thing but it's not for us reaching into these areas where the gospel hasn't gone. Mm-hmm. So for us, we really target it and keep it narrow as to, is this meeting our specific vision, kingdom initiative? And we keep that really narrow. So if it does, great, then we're in, because there's a million opportunities that pop up. And over time, it does evolve, right? Like, because right now we're realizing one of the greatest cross-cultural contexts that there is on the planet is from one generation to the next. It's actually not from here to some remote part of Afghanistan. It honestly is, are we effectively passing this to the next generation? And that cultural divide has gotten wide. So we have some opportunities now to be a part of different organizations that are really reaching into that, because we are moving from these terms, in social science are crystallized and fluid intelligence being your ability to problem solve, and that tends to peak in your 20s and quickly decline. Crystallized intelligence would be your wisdom, which kind of starts to peak in your 40s, 50s, 60s, and goes beyond. And you need to be able to get between those two curves, or you have a midlife crisis. And we're both, my partner and I, are 51 right now. So we're in this pivot point of like, okay, as we're looking at this very focused question of how do we make sure the gospel goes where it hasn't, one of the new pieces we're looking at is how do we pass on our wisdom to the next generation? How do we make sure that, like, starting with our inner circle of our family, our kids, and working out from there, so that we're not just solely focused on a mission, but like passing it on, and so that it evolves with time.
You thought about writing a book?
I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, I do write in books, but as to writing a book, I wouldn't know how to start. There's a lot that goes on inside this head that has to get out some way, but I don't know that I could ever organize it well enough to make it something that anyone would want to read.
We'll have to talk more about that. Okay, I feel like that'd be a great story to tell.
I've been asked that several times. So, yeah.
When you realize, or your partner realizes, that you guys have gotten too in the business, specifically, like, tell me how you realized that. Like, when did that surface?
So I think we both build a dashboard. He's a different personality than me. He's very, he's not to go back to the Enneagram, but he's an Enneagram 9, which is really rare in surgeons, and I'm an 8. Which is
9 is the peacemaker.
Correct.
Kind of
is kind of just
challenger.
Yeah, an unpleasant human being. So difficult to live with. But I think for
all
me,
you need is an 8 with self-awareness, and you're okay.
Yeah. So to that point, I've built a dashboard for myself of knowing. I just got a phone call with my practice administrator before I came over here about, like, I think this week, actually, there's some lights flashing on my dashboard of things where I've gotten pulled into details on things. And so I know for me, when, like, in your brain, there's this thing called the limbic system, which is like your kind of, it's your primitive type brain. It's emotional. That's all it is. It's just emotional. And when I'm living limbically, it's like with your 4-year-old, when you say, like, use your words, that's your way of saying move emotions from your limbic system to your prefrontal cortex where you can think about it. And when I start moving emotionally, like about worry or anxiety or anger, it's time for me to pause. I've gotten too far into the details. And to use that same limbic prefrontal cortex analogy, when I move it to my prefrontal cortex, this meaty part of your brain in front of your skull, where you can now consider your emotions, where you don't just take an emotion and act on it. You think about, why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling angry? And now I know, well, I'm not in a good place. And for me, I then go back spiritually to say, and so actually, like last night, spent a fair amount of time with the Lord saying, I'm not in the right place right now. And so we can elevate. And then I've talked with my partner today. And so we have these warning lights set up. Yeah. And we all kind of know when we're getting pulled away from the main thing.
Well, it's such a good word. And for anybody who wants to go deeper on the subject, there is a author and pastor named Pete Scazzaro, who has done some incredible work on these ideas, and he'll frequently use the maybe overused, but analogy of the iceberg, where your emotions are the above the water sort of things that you see. And one of his big presses is you've got to dig down and ask the bigger questions. Where are these anxieties, fears, angers coming from? Because there is, if you just take them, receive them whole hog, unquestioned, that oftentimes is not going to take you to a good place. And when you're willing to do the deep work and ask, okay, where's this coming from and what may need to adjust as a result, that is where you can really learn some things. Now, let me back up to the extent you're willing to share about it. So this is going way back in our conversation. You were climbing, I forget what mountain, with your son. You said he was 12?
Well, he wasn't climbing there. So the story kind of starts where I was climbing the 7 summits. So I was working through. Yeah. So there's 7 highest peaks on 7 continents. I was on the second one, Mount Aconcagua in Argentina, and we had climbed to high camp, which is at about 19,000 feet, and set out that morning for the summit. It was waist deep snow. We'd gotten a lot of snow. Aconcagua usually doesn't have a lot of that, but it was minus 40 when we left. I was in the first group that went out, so we were kind of breaking trail in waist deep snow, got to this high balcony, and had to sit and wait for the rest of our team to catch up, which took about 45 minutes. By the time they got there, I was cold. And I had kind of just promised my wife, she kind of jokingly, we always had this rule of, come back dead but not disabled, right? Because I'm not taking care of you kind of thing. So I'm joking, but
I got it.
But she, but I knew I wasn't clear at that point.
Yeah.
And so I made a hard decision to quit and turn back. And it was really one of the most difficult things I've ever done, because I don't remember to that point having ever quit on something in life. Went back to my tent, had to wait like 8 or 12 hours in my tent to kind of for the rest of the group to summit and come down. And in that moment, it wasn't an audible word from God, but it was a shaking inside of me that there were things that needed to change. As I came home, that started with a 12-year-old boy who was begging me to go on a missions trip. And that was my middle son, Evan. And my business partner actually had put this brochure on my desk for an organization that looked largely humanitarian. And it had been sitting on my desk for 6 months. He just knew I was a climber. This organization was working in the Himalayas. And I just kind of filed it under the I will never do this kind of a thing, because it looked humanitarian. And it looked humanitarian because a lot of the work they were doing was using humanitarian platforms to do other work. Long and short, that organization I ended up reaching out to, which was Josh's organization, and calling him and saying, hey, here's the deal. I don't know you, you don't know me, but I would love to go on one of your trips. But here's the thing, I want to bring this 12-year-old kid, to which Josh immediately said, no, we don't bring 12-year-old kids. We hadn't had any of that. And so I tried to explain to him, my son had climbed with me on a lot of the 14ers by this point. He climbed his first 14er, which is a 14,000-foot peak in Colorado, when he was 6, and he'd climbed several by then. I was like, I think he'll do fine. Anyway, Josh turned around and spoke with Jack, who you referenced earlier, and I think they finally said, we'll take a risk on these two, and we came. And that trip forever transformed our family's life. When we came home from that trip, I just told my wife, I was like, I know things have to change. And she was actually like relieved, like, great, I've been waiting for this moment. Because at that point, I really had become the private practice plastic surgeon. And I thought my role was just to be in a church and be a member and, maybe teach here and there and give money. But I didn't feel like God was calling me into something. What I didn't realize is the ripple effect in my family. That 12-year-old boy today, fast forward, he had a rowing scholarship to row crew at a prominent school here in the East Coast, was going to be a pre-med major, just like his father. And then God got a hold of his heart. He took a gap year, decided I want to hit the pause button, which in a high achieving family, you just don't do. But he took a gap year, spent some time in New Zealand and the Philippines, and then in Nepal. That led to a second gap year in Kona, Hawaii. Came back, changed his major, walked away from his scholarship, changed to an international studies major with a kind of a major/minor in Arabic, and is planning to go work overseas and wants to go to law school, but wants to work in refugee law. Okay. And so his whole purpose in life has now been targeted to how do I shape my college experience so that I can be most effectively positioned to be where I want to be, which for him is kind of in the nations. And so that moment, honestly, where a person said yes to letting my son and I come on the trip, changed our life. And now it's changed countless other people's lives, because that was the moment or another moment where God was able to reach in and just really kind of put his yoke around us in terms of where he was, taking us.
You said that through that trip that you came back saying some things need to change. What kinds of things did you have in mind? I mean, I'm guessing there may be some of these that we've talked about already with the practice, but maybe there are other things. I don't know.
Yeah, it was, I just knew that now my purpose wasn't just to make money, be a resource for the kingdom from that standpoint. It's, I knew personally it was going to have to look like simplifying my life, which I'm not sure I still know how to do, but my wife's really good at. She's never been about things or comfort. And so it looked a lot like starting to change your environment. It's like, if you work in a cluttered office, you're not very effective. Studies have shown that over and over again. And I think the same thing is true spiritually. If you don't change your spiritual environment, you're never going to look like who God wants you to be. It's not about externalism, but it's just about creating a healthy environment where you can grow and become what he wants you to be. And for us, that looked like getting rid of some stuff.
When it came to how your own personal growth and transformation and call to be more engaged in missions affected your parenting, what did that look like for how you functioned as a father to your kids? How did you structure your family in a way that, because really to the first part of our conversation, what you don't want to do and what I don't want to do as a pastor is create an environment where following Jesus and really being passionate for the kingdom means you can't do the rowing scholarship and that you shouldn't go toward X, Y, or Z.
Right.
So we've got to walk this line of having a huge vision for the kingdom that our kids catch and want to live into without bifurcating. There's the really spiritual, right on point with Jesus stuff, and then there's the everyday stuff. How did you guys do your parenting so that they could capture a holistic view of what it means to follow Christ?
Yeah, you make a really good point. And just to clarify, it's messy, right? It sounds much cleaner in retrospect as I talk about it now, but it was messy as we were doing it. And so I think you make a really good point that if Evan had gone and rowed and become a prima, there would have been nothing wrong with that. The core of that experience for him was just that he was able to hear the voice of God.
Sure.
And that redirected him. And so I think the way that looks practically, if you pull it from Scripture, is in Deuteronomy 6, God talks about, when he's sharing with the children of Israel, here's how you're going to look different to the nations that I'm going to send you to over the next, several hundred or thousand years. You're going to talk about me with your family. I'm paraphrasing, but when you're at home, when you're on the road, when you're everywhere, it becomes very organic, because if the only spiritual conversation you have with your child is at church or through a proxy at church or through a para-Christian organization and you're not having it, it's not happening because there's no one else who can have that role in your child. Now, there's children who rise above that and have those proxies, but it really looks like an everyday conversation, meaning we're in the truck going hunting, we're talking about really what God's doing in my life. And I'm being very open, you're crafting it a little bit, but it's just talking about it all the time. If we're skiing in the mountains, we're talking about it. My boys and I, they now go heli skiing with me up in Canada. We're talking about it the whole time. We might be having an experience, but that's not really what we're doing. We're kicking it around all the time. And so each of my kids, it's evolved differently. Each of them carry that differently now in terms of how God's made them. But we still talk about it all the time. So I think it's that Deuteronomy 6 principle.
Yeah, that's so good. Now, obviously what Deuteronomy 6, the premise that's really important here and that's evident in your life and your wife's life is you have to be actively, authentically following Jesus for yourself. That's the prerequisite, I think, for being a godly parent, because then there's so many different resources and all this stuff. We talked a little bit earlier about how we've kind of each in our own way when it comes to marriage, maybe haven't our marriages, we don't do check every box that maybe the Christian system says you do this and then you're supposed to do that. But what we've said over the years is, and I say this to newly married couples all the time and those getting engaged, we've just tried to follow Jesus as passionately as we can and as authentically as we can. And a lot of that has just kind of overflowed into our marriage. It's not been, now we've read some books and we've been to some conferences and all that, but it's not been that. It's been follow Jesus with everything we've got. Well, similarly, what I hear you saying is, you're doing your best to follow Jesus. Not perfectly, you're not claiming, hey, I've got it all figured out, but I am on the journey to say, God, my life is at your disposal. And I'm committed to having authentic conversations with my kids about my journey. And then just the atmosphere we're creating in our family, they're just breathing in what it looks like to walk with Jesus authentically. And then they're going to work that out with the help of the Holy Spirit in their own fashion. Such a great example of parenting. What are the other kids doing right now?
So my daughter is a nurse. She's a team lead for neurosurgery at Dallas Children's Hospital.
Okay.
She's working on her doctorate right now. She's going to become a nurse practitioner. And then my other son, we think he thinks he's interested in medicine, but he doesn't want to tell us that right now. So he's studying neuroscience. He's at Baylor.
Okay.
But they're all kind of pointed in different vectors and directions, but that's where they're at.
That's really cool. And if you don't mind sharing, I know some of the work that you're probably part of is in places in the world and that we can't talk about openly because of just sensitivities of Jesus relative to the environments. But do you mind sharing some of the things that you're up to when it comes to a missions perspective?
Yeah, now I think we've kind of pivoted towards what I alluded to earlier, this passing of the torch between generations. And so some of that looks like in indigenous work, which is obviously indigenous-led works are the ones that are most sustainable. They know their cultural context and I think have the most effectiveness just from the standpoint of mobility and their passport. And so we're working with indigenous people in some, what we would call restricted access types of environments where just empowering them and equipping in a way that right now is just a unique season. And then also looking at, those of us who have the next generation, we might say in the West, that are interested, trying to reach to that generation as well. And I think that's becoming a real burden for me and my wife, just because we happen to be here in the West and trying to be a mouthpiece for a lot of times just to parents to say, like, it's okay to let your child, if they know Jesus and are following him as best they know, to follow their passion, like that, whatever that fire is that God put inside of them, and teaching, because sometimes it rings and lands differently from somebody who is deemed as a high achiever, like maybe we might be. You're not expecting to hear somebody who's a surgeon say, it's okay if your kid doesn't go to college. It's okay if your kid becomes an artist. It's okay if your kid, meaning that if they're following Christ and they have a passion inside of them, you should pour gasoline on that, blow oxygen on it. You should encourage them in it, help them. The greatest tension you can ever put them in is to name them something different than God's named them,
Yeah, boy, it's so many good words here. I feel like we're gonna take different excerpts of this conversation to be able to highlight, and I just know that there are going to be so many good opportunities for people to glean from the journey that you've been on. When you think about your passion for the next generation specifically, and we will have, without a doubt, a number of people of, I would call next-gen folks listening right now. Is there anything that you would say to them in some ways as a father would say to a child, or as a leader would say to a mentee, but is there anything you would say as kind of your final word today?
Yeah, it would be the most important things you can do in life, is to first love God and then love others. We know that that's the important prerequisite. And then inside of that, to understand who you are. And I think we teach kids all the time to just be pragmatic, get a job, have enough money, save for retirement, and that's a great way to waste your life. To figure out what is the passion inside of you that God has put you on this planet for, understanding kind of the coherence of who you are, what your purpose on this life is, and then finding your satisfaction in that. And I think that those would be the things that if we could pass that to the next generation, it would feel like life has been well spent.
I said that was going to be the last word, but then I've got a tag on yet. Okay. If somebody right now is trying to follow their passion and they're asking the question, what does this look like relative to integrating with the kingdom? Any final words on that subject specifically?
Yeah, I think you don't need to figure that out. I think you just need to be who God wanted you to be. That's the story of Daniel, Joseph, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. None of them sat down and, I think, thought through, how does this work out? Just be who God wanted you to be. Be the person. A lot of times you're going to be in a room that allows God to be in the room with you. And so that might be with world leaders. That might be in a nursery somewhere. That might be painting in a studio. But you're going to invite God into that room because you followed your passion there. So you don't need to figure that out. If you seek him first, or the kingdom first, all these other things, the details will get added in.
Right on, right on. Well, Jeremy, I feel like it's been such an honor and privilege to have you with us today, and I know that God's going to use this conversation to encourage and I hope challenge many people. Keep up the great work that you're doing, and I can't wait to continue to see your legacy build. I'm going to continue to stay on your case about this book idea, and I'm excited for what God has to do in your journey and in the next generation. Thanks for being with us.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Well, I don't know about you, but I was so encouraged by our conversation with Jeremy today, and I just love his example of taking the gifts, the passions, and the talents that God has given him and leveraging them fully to make a massive difference in this world for the kingdom of God. Such a great story. And I want to say, if you were encouraged by this story, please like us, share us, make a comment online. We'd love for you to help us get the word out about this podcast. And listen, this has been a production of Engedi Church. We want to bring more and more conversations just like this your way. So until next time, just know you were made to advance.